Gentlemen, I'd like to call this plenary session to order. I'd first like to welcome our new governors, Governor Stevens of Montana, Governor Bayh of Indiana, and Governor Caperton of West Virginia. We're delighted to have you here today as members of this organization. Next, I'd like to ask for a motion and a second to adopt our usual rules of procedure for this plenary session. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second? All in favor say aye. All opposed, no. Thank you very much. Next, I'd like to welcome a delegation from the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, who I believe is in the audience. Would you please stand? Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I also would like to have the pleasure of reading two paragraphs from President Bush's letter, a copy of which has been placed before you. The President's letter says, in part, "It's a pleasure for me to extend greetings to all of you at your winter meeting. When I met with your executive committee last November, things were rather chaotic, matters uncertain. Now matters are a bit more clear. For one thing, you have lost your Granite State colleague, and I have gained a pit bull. I regret that I can't be with you in person this time, but I did want to offer you my best wishes for a productive session as you address the many issues important to the future of our country. I know your meetings will be spirited, as they should be, but I hope that spirit includes a healthy dose of bipartisanship. We need such cooperation to tackle the challenges facing our nation. Such cooperation must extend as well between the White House and the executive mansions. I intend to turn to you often to draw on your expertise and experience in state leadership, and I want you to know that you have a ready listener in Washington." The letter is signed, George Bush. Ladies and gentlemen, let me set the tone for this extraordinary plenary session. America is in transition. There is a new Congress, a new administration, and a new decade, all within sight of a new century, and we face an international frontier. Fiber optics span the continents. Billions move in seconds from Tokyo to New York. Goods move around the world in a single day. As we mentioned at the Executive Committee a moment ago, a century ago, the sun never set on the British Empire. Today, the sun never sets on the world stock markets. What does it mean? And what are we prepared to do about it? As we gather today, we see that in general terms, the American states and territories have reached the end of this decade in mixed condition. Some states are economically strong. Some have difficulties. Some are growing fast, some too fast, some not fast enough. Yet the states have this in common. Without regard to party label, there is broad recognition that in the present circumstances, no state can afford to mark time. Whether one describes the current attitude of state government as activist, progressive, or simply problem-solving, the occupants of America's state capitals are convinced that we must either take charge of the future or the future will take charge of us. Since the latter is unacceptable, the former has become compelling. The agenda adopted during last summer's NGA meeting in Cincinnati testifies to that fact. It is called America in Transition, the International Frontier. It is an agenda for action, composed of 6 task forces designed to advance on 2 fronts, within our borders and beyond our borders. This agenda acknowledges a fact of life for every governor in this room, that change is constant, that the world is interdependent, that the states are vulnerable to economic events that once were very remote. Writing in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, financial advisor Felix Rohatyn says that the term domestic policy is an outmoded expression and an obsolete concept. He says, "It is obvious that government policies with respect to education, taxes, infrastructure, and entitlements affect mostly our own citizens." But he asserts those policies can only be formulated within the framework of an economic policy that is global in nature and concept. and that is the position of the states. We know that for our businesses and communities to successfully reach beyond our borders and engage the world economy, we must plan, prepare, and invest to strengthen within state borders. Clear-headed self-examination and hard-headed pursuit of solutions. That is the order of the day for governors across this country. When we see American firms losing market share in their own domestic economy, when we see productivity lag and natural advantages squandered, we should act. Competitiveness must begin at home. When urban water systems deteriorate and transportation systems stall, then we should act. If we're going to cross the oceans and sell our products, we'll first have to get our cars across town. When infant mortality rates remain a disgrace, when inadequate child care undercuts the workforce, when future parents, workers, and taxpayers are being shortchanged before they reach adolescence, then we should act. So strengthening within our borders, it means competing in our own markets, moving our people and products, and preparing our children. If we can make progress on these issues, we will be in a far better position to take on the challenges of an international economy. But that too is a challenge in and of its own, the challenge of competing beyond our borders. We should cultivate an export program, develop programs that identify markets, encourage producers and suppliers to look for customers anywhere they can find them, even on the other side of the world. And we should do in the laboratories of the next century what the Edisons, Morses, and Firestones did in the last one. We should be the inventors, the innovators, the technical revolutionaries. We have got to get there first and do it better. Ignorance is a self-inflicted wound, no matter what the circumstances. But ignorance of geography, languages, and foreign cultures is a mortal wound in the international economy. It's time for our students to learn the language of the international customers, to know where they live, how they live, and what they want. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is our agenda. It is as ambitious as it is justified. Within our borders, we intend to encourage expansion of domestic markets and investments in our infrastructure and children. And beyond our borders, we intend to find new foreign markets, advance international education, and invest in research technology. Even as we gather here today, President Bush is meeting with Far Eastern leaders in Japan, China, and Korea. He knows, as we know, that the accelerating pace of change in the world, social, political, and economic, does not grant us the luxury of quiet contemplation. So we should engage in the community of nations and agree on a plan of action for ourselves. Throughout this country's history, throughout all of our cultural, political, and economic development, we have confronted uncertainty, difficulty, and adversity. This challenge is different, to be sure. All new challenges in a changing world are different. And yet, in a certain sense, our present challenge is like all the rest. Whether we succeed or fail will be determined by our willingness to act with foresight, intelligence, and resolve. This agenda of the National Governors Association and the task force reports that will be released between now and July will give force and support behind those who see the need to act and are ready to do so. Thank you. And now let me introduce a very special guest. As we look beyond our borders, it is difficult to determine if our leaders shape the world in which they live or if they are shaped by it. Would we have had Lend-Lease without Roosevelt and Churchill? A missile crisis without Castro? Armed controls treaties without John Kennedy or Ronald Reagan? One thing is certain: the 20th century would not have been the same without Henry Kissinger. Dr. Kissinger has helped define the metes and bounds of foreign policy for more than a generation. From shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East to détente with the Soviet Union, he has defined the playing field, the players, and often dictated the score. He helped open the door to China, and closed the door to Vietnam. Dr. Kissinger has helped us make the connections between the U.S. and the Persian Gulf, between the U.S. and the problems and the potential in the Third World, between the American states and the international frontier. He has helped us understand that our national security is tied not only to the weapons of war, but the world marketplace. Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, the Medal of Freedom, the Medal of Liberty, and the Nobel Peace Prize. I can think of only one item missing from this list of accomplishments: an address to the National Governors Association. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Henry Kissinger.
Thank you. Governor Bailout, ladies and gentlemen, this introduction leaves me in the position in which I found myself at a reception once, where a lady walked up to me and said, "I understand you're a fascinating man," she said. "Fascinate me." It turned into one of the less successful conversations that I have had. Now, your chairman suggested that I keep my remarks to 15 or 20 minutes, forgetting that my native language is German and that it isn't easy to place a verb in 20 minutes in German. At any rate, should I accede to that suggestion, you can all say you were present at a historic occasion. I thought in my remarks, I would talk to you about some philosophical or conceptual problems of American foreign policy as I see them, illustrating them perhaps briefly with some comments on East-West relations. And then you can ask me on any subject that interests you. There's a great deal of talk about bipartisanship in foreign policy. And we hear a lot about it. I've talked about it myself, probably where I heard it. But and I believe in it. But we have to define what it is that we should be bipartisan about. It is almost impossible to be bipartisan on the day-to-day tactics of foreign policy if there is not some basic agreement on where we are trying to go and what the fundamental premises of foreign policy are supposed to be. If these premises are absent, then the quest for bipartisanship can easily degenerate into the lowest common denominator, which does no justice to any point of view. Now, I would like to suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, that the fundamental problem of American foreign policy, especially with respect to bipartisanship, is that we have not agreed on the fundamental premises, and we have not agreed on the fundamental premises because America has not had to conduct foreign policy the way other nations have had to conduct foreign policy until the last 1 or 2 decades. Through the greater part of American history, we were removed from world affairs. When we emerged internationally at the end of World War II, we were in an extremely unusual position. We had an atomic monopoly, and we had such a huge preponderance of economic resources that for us the fundamental problem was to identify an issue and then overwhelm it with resources. We did not face the dilemma that all other nations have had to face and that we are facing now, which is that when your scope for action is greatest, your knowledge is at a minimum. And when your knowledge is greatest, your scope for creative action has usually disappeared. If you do not have the overwhelming resources that we possessed at the end of World War II, everything depends on an assessment you cannot prove true when you make it. And you must therefore act on the basis of some moral or political or philosophical conviction about the kind of world that you're trying to bring about and the kind of world in which you find yourself. This has been lacking. I would argue that the American domestic debate has been polarized between those who consider foreign policy a subdivision of psychiatry and others who treat foreign policy as a subdivision of theology. The psychiatric approach treats relations between nations like relations between people, and it emphasizes personal goodwill, atmosphere, creating a climate out of which then almost automatically reconciliation will emerge. The theological approach sees foreign policy as a struggle of between good and evil, and is convinced that the walls of Jericho will crumble if the trumpet is blown hard enough. And at the margin, the theological and psychiatric approach meet each other, because both of them tend to believe that international quarrels are akin to personal quarrels, that they therefore can be ended by single individuals, and that foreign policy can be akin to conversion. The nostalgia of American foreign policy in most administrations since the post-war period. I must say, Richard Nixon, probably the only major exception. The nostalgia of American foreign policy has been that someday some Soviet leader would come along who is just like a regular guy. There is the belief that Soviet leaders are really misunderstood or potential mid-Americans. I have a friend who is of the view that there is no such thing as an English accent, that the English put this on to intimidate Americans. And if you catch an Englishman unawares, like waking him up at 4 in the morning, he will talk like any other normal human being. That has been the American approach, I would argue, to the Soviet Union in the entire post-war period. Richard Nixon being an exception, since he was not fully convinced of the permanent goodwill of all Americans. He was not about to trust any Russian.
Very good.
So that seems to me to be the fundamental challenge to the American approach to foreign policy. When I was a professor, I was fascinated by the problem of the construction of peaceful international orders. The question of war and peace has to preoccupy anyone concerned with international affairs. And I studied peace settlements, historic peace settlements, those that lasted and those that proved ephemeral, and try to understand what the reasons were for those settlements. And I'd like to advance one or two propositions and then apply them to the contemporary period. Any international settlement involving many different nations of complicatedly different histories and vastly different domestic experience must represent a balance, on the one hand, between various notions of justice or legitimacy. What is a just international order? And, of course, no settlement can ever perfectly satisfy everybody. Because if somebody were perfectly satisfied, the odds are that somebody else would be perfectly dissatisfied. So the problem is to find a relative balance between the conflicting notions of what is just. And perhaps one could express it in this way, that the inevitable dissatisfactions should not be so great as to lead any major nation to try to upset the international structure rather than live within it. The Congress of Vienna achieved this and brought peace for 100 years. The Treaty of Versailles did not achieve it and produced another war in 20 years. The second problem is that precisely because there will always be some dissatisfaction, there exists a balance of power which discourages those who would want to express their dissatisfaction by recourse to force. Those seem to me to be the two essential elements. The American tradition, from Wilson to Reagan, tends to reject both of these propositions. We look for perfect satisfaction, and we reject the notion of balance of power. If you read American statesmen from Wilson through Reagan, you will see that we are trying to create something in which there is universal bliss, and in which the concept of balance of power is considered a contributing cause to international tension, instead of one means not of removing it, but of containing it. Obviously, if there are huge dissatisfactions, which is another way of saying if there are huge ideological conflicts, the emphasis on power has to be all the greater. If there are reduced ideological tensions, it is possible to have a greater relaxation with respect to the balance of power. It can never be absent. It can never be ignored, and it is ignored only at great peril. Now let me apply this to the current state of East-West relations, and then make a few general observations. The West is swept at this moment by an obsession with the personality of one Soviet leader. I have met Gorbachev as well 4 or 5 times, recently 3 weeks ago. There's no question that he's the most interesting, the most thoughtful Soviet leader that any Western leader has encountered and that has existed. At the same time, I do not suffer from the belief that the Soviet Politburo elects its leaders for the entertainment of Western visitors. And if one looks at the history of the Soviet Union, it is not the office of General Secretary of the Communist Party. It's not an office that choir boys are likely to reach. No Soviet leader has ever retired with honor. In fact, no Soviet leader has ever retired. No Soviet leader has ever survived his own death. Every Soviet leader has been assaulted by his successor. It is therefore logical to assume that only a tremendous desire to exercise power could induce a man to enter so precarious a career. But I'm willing to grant Gorbachev most of what he says. I'd like to raise a more fundamental proposition. It is not in the interest of those who are concerned with peace to argue that only one Soviet leader can bring about peace. It is not in our interest to conduct foreign policy on the basis that we have to help one particular Soviet leader, given the fact that we have no control over who stays in office. That in any event, political life is short compared to history. It is in our interest to create a situation in which it is in the interest of any Soviet leader to pursue more moderate policies, and where any Soviet leader would come to more or less the same conclusions. Now, I think, in fact, we are at a phase where this is within the capacity of Western leaders, provided they are willing to be serious about the problem of peace. The Cold War, in the sense of an ideological conflict, is ending. It is ending because the great advantage that communism had through most of its history of possessing in each country an identifiable group of individuals who preferred to assist the homeland of communism over its own national aspirations, that asset is dissipating. The ideological elan of communism is dissipating inside the Soviet Union and certainly outside the Soviet Union. Nobody looks at the Soviet Union anymore or at communist ideology as a model either for political organization or for economic organization. On the other hand, certain realities remain. The Soviet Union is militarily an extraordinarily powerful country. And secondly, if you look at Soviet history and at Russian history, the Russian Empire, under Tsars and Commissars, has been expanding inexorably for 400 years. It has often been invaded. But at the end of the process, Russian borders in every century, under any ruler, have expanded by hundreds of thousands or by thousands of square miles. The fundamental problem of peace, therefore, with the Soviet Union has been one, ideology. But secondly, is it possible for the first time in history to live in equilibrium with a state that when it wasn't invaded, expanded? Is it possible for it to accept a rational concept of security? That is to say, security within its national borders without attempting to disintegrate all the countries on its borders. Throughout history, the Russian solution under Tsar and Commissar has been to weaken and to disintegrate any significantly strong country anywhere within its reach. They have sought absolute security. But absolute security for one country means absolute insecurity for every other country. So in negotiations that will now be in train with the Soviet Union, that has to be the fundamental problem. Now we have many assets. One is, it has been said, that the Soviet Union is the only country in the world entirely surrounded by hostile communist countries. The satellite orbit in Eastern Europe, China, it has learned, it has experienced that implanting communist regimes creates as many security problems for it as it solves. Secondly, all its neighbors, communist or not, are growing faster by far than the Soviet Union. Japan, China, even India, Western Europe, and the United States. Gorbachev has put himself in this dilemma. To achieve his objective of disintegrating or weakening NATO, he has to appear peaceful. But even if he's insincere, if he gives up the appearance of it, he will again unify all the countries around his periphery against him. So what started as a tactic could be turned into a necessity. This is one asset we have. The second asset we have is that it is absolutely impossible to undertake the restructuring of communist Russia that needs to be undertaken if it is to be prevented from becoming a third-rate or the leading underdeveloped country. If that is to be prevented, Soviet leaders will be absorbed with domestic affairs for a long period of time. As far as the West is concerned, this requires that we have some precise notion of what we understand by a peaceful order. Wallowing in the good personal relationship between American leaders and Soviet leaders is not an answer. If there are tensions, they must have causes. And if there are, the causes can be identified. Let me give one example. All the negotiations have concerned arms control. The issues of arms control have become so esoteric and so abstruse that one can apply to them what was said about some 19th century foreign policy issue, about which Lord Palmerston, the British Foreign Secretary, said, only 3 people have ever understood this. One is dead, second is in the lunatic asylum, he said, and he was the third, and he had forgotten it. It is interesting that every arms control agreement is justified domestically on the ground that it doesn't make any difference, that it leaves our military capacity unimpaired. Then why make it? I'm not against. There was one I was against, but for different reasons. But as we get into conventional disarmament, we will not be able to avoid the future of Europe. A conventional disarmament that is significant enough to reduce Soviet offensive capabilities in Europe, and that has guarantees against Soviet re-entry, and that pushes the Soviet army far enough back into the Soviet Union so that it cannot return easily. All of these conditions must be met, or we just have a paper agreement. That will affect the future of Eastern Europe. And the future of Eastern Europe is in any case being affected by the trends within the Soviet Union. So actually, I believe there is an opportunity to attempt to negotiate a restoration of historic Europe including the East European countries, and to turn arms control into a discussion of how normal security concerns of the Soviet Union could be met by military dispositions within Europe without giving them the right or acquiescing in the continued maintenance of regimes resented by the entire population. In other words, we have to find a political basis for the next round of negotiations. One could go around the world and make similar analyses. President is today in Asia. In Asia, actually, we're dealing with countries unlikely to be seduced by personalities, countries with a long history of nationalism and a very cold-blooded approach to the conduct of their own policies, as anybody who has had to compete with them has experienced. In Asia, we have a problem of a new emerging balance of power in which the United States could play the role of a balancer. In the Middle East, other opportunities exist, each of which needs to be analyzed individually. I want to mention one area very briefly that concerns me deeply, which is the Western Hemisphere. When we look at a new international structure, we have to keep in mind that in Mexico, a new government has come into being. Brazil and Argentina will have elections this year. In all of these countries, there have been advances towards democracy. All of these countries have undergone nearly a decade of austerity. It is not possible to maintain the democratic regimes in these countries unless a process of growth is restored, and unless that is done in some cooperation with the United States. In the emerging world, in which economic blocs are developing in Europe, de facto in Asia, it would be a tragedy if all of American attention were focused on how to deal with the predictable upheavals in the Western Hemisphere if we cannot act in time, and which means particularly that some constructive solution of the debt problem is required. It is, and we should not pretend that we have any choice about it, because if we do not take the initiative, it will be imposed on us. Now, I have already talked more than 20 minutes, and therefore let me conclude with just one observation. I have a Chinese friend who claims that there exists following Chinese proverb. I say claims because I have my doubt that there exist as many Chinese proverbs as they lay upon us. But his argument is, the proverb allegedly goes like this: when there's turmoil under the heavens, little problems are dealt with as if they were big problems. And big problems are not dealt with at all. When there is order under the heavens, big problems are reduced to little problems. And little problems need not obsess us. My argument is that when we look around the world, we have an unusual opportunity to shape a more peaceful and more constructive international order. Not in the traditional sense of the universal reconciliation of everybody at a moment in time where one can then say peace will break out, but in the sense that with each decade there will be a greater consciousness of a sense of security and of the possibility of progress. And indeed, the United States is the only nation that can say that the ability to reduce big problems to smaller problems is importantly in its own hands. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kissinger, for your thoughtful and informative views. We have several questions, the first of which will come from Governor Branstad of Iowa.
Dr. Kissinger, in light of the comments you made about the enamoration that the West has had with General Secretary Gorbachev and the uncertainty about the future leadership in the Soviet Union, is it wise for individual states to pursue long-term trade relationships with the Soviet Union? Many of us are interested in trying to establish greater trade opportunities and have looked at the Soviet Union as a potential of substantial trade. And do you think it's wise for us to pursue long-term trade opportunities with the USSR?
Well, I think only if you understand what is the likely economic evolution in the Soviet Union. In my view, the major part of economic reform has not even started yet. Gorbachev has been primarily preoccupied with achieving a political position that will enable him to overcome the dilemma of any communist state that you cannot run an economy by central planning, but you may not be able to run a communist state without central planning because that's where the Communist Party has its power base. So he is in the process of elaborating an office of the president. Up to now, the president of the Soviet Union, the primary function of the president was to greet visiting firemen at the airport. And when Gromyko was president, I visited him once and I asked him to tell me what the job entailed, and he was not able really to do it. Now, he he's moving executive powers into the office of the presidency, and he has given himself a fixed term in office, which will be elected by the so-called Supreme Soviet, which he will keep in permanent session, so that theoretically at least he cannot be removed by the Central Committee of the Communist Party anymore, since his power doesn't derive from it. Until he has achieved that, which will be by the end of this year, if everything goes as he plans, he will not have undertaken major economic reforms. Once he turns to major economic reforms, I find it very difficult to see how that in fact is going to work. It is in a country which has very little entrepreneurial tradition. In China, you have a homogeneous society, you have a homogeneous culture anyway. You have overseas Chinese, you have Hong Kong, you have Taiwan, you have Singapore, and the Communist Party hasn't been in power only about half the time that it has been in the Soviet Union. In Russia, he will come up against vastly entrenched interests, a tradition of Potemkin villages, and I think the likelihood of that turning into a total mess is at least as great as the likelihood that it will succeed. On that basis, if one recognizes the risks, I don't think it's going to stimulate the economy of your state in your term of office very greatly.
Let me just say that we're a state that sells a lot of corn and soybeans already to the Soviet Union, and we see this as a potential, I guess, for additional agriculture market. But we also are selling them some paving equipment and some other things in terms of helping them to try to make some of the infrastructure changes they need to restructure their economy.
They need a lot of things. And any one thing that they choose to pay for, they can undoubtedly find the resources for. As a general proposition, I used to be bothered by the large European loans because I thought it was a kind of moral abdication by the Europeans to do this without having some progress towards a political settlement. I'm now coming to the view that unless the Soviets change their infrastructure substantially, that money will be down the drain. This does not mean that an agricultural state that is already exporting to them, that there cannot be some counter trade, and that any one thing that they want, that they need urgently, they can pay for because they have gold and they export some commodities. But I do not foresee a huge expansion of trade within, say, 5 years.
Dr. Kissinger, I think we have time for two questions. Governor Thompson of Illinois and Governor Celeste of Ohio have indicated an interest. Governor Thompson first.
Dr. Kissinger, going back to your earlier remarks on the 400-year history of the Soviet Union expanding its borders and the growth of its empire, do you think that now that the glasnost is out of the bag and unlikely to be put back in even under a separate leader, that the weakness and disarray of the Soviet economy, which Russians now openly see and discuss and are becoming increasingly impatient with, so we are given to understand by the popular press, makes it more likely that the Soviet Union will be unable to sustain the military share of the budget that they have had in the past, and thus lead to a more balance of power approach rather than a dominating approach?
Russia has always been a state different from certainly other European states and different from any state that I've studied. I read what European diplomats were saying at various periods when Tsars died and new Tsars came in, to see what the perception was of Russia at the time. And the interesting thing is, they often said exactly the same thing that we say when a communist leader dies, saying, well, this other guy was a pretty awful fellow, but this new one is going to be a modernizer, and he's going to... And Russia has had this peculiarity. I don't know whether most people know that John Paul Jones wound up as the commander of the Russian Navy. That was the end. They did that. All of their top leaders until well into the 19th century were foreigners. All of their foreign ministers were, most of them were Germans. At one point they had a Greek. They hired foreigners to run their country, and they looked always weak, except they had this tremendous patriotism and this tremendous courage of their people. So even at periods where by rational European-type calculations one would have expected them to stay within their borders, they usually conducted a fairly active and aggressive foreign policy. Now, since the army is their most efficient instrument, it is not self-evident to me that what you say is logically true, that they should be preoccupied with domestic reform, except they never have in their history, and it's never, and so there are no easy models that they could follow. Secondly, I fear very much that what could happen is that if nobody pays attention and nobody talks to them about what's likely to occur, the disintegration of Eastern Europe could proceed so rapidly that they will do something dramatic to show where who's got the power. And so I think as long as their control of Eastern Europe is weakening anyway, one should negotiate the process in such a way that their political withdrawal can continue without this upheaval by putting it within the context of security negotiations. Logically, you would have to assume that if perestroika and glasnost go beyond a certain point, that their capacity to act internationally will be diminished. But the record of disintegrating empires, I mean, the tendency of them, I mean, when the Ottoman Empire started disintegrating in the 19th century, it led to endless tensions and frequent wars. But surely they will be preoccupied with domestic problems.
Final question, Governor Celeste.
Thank you very much. Secretary Kissinger, I heard you describe two very exciting changes that are challenging us now. One is a change from a preoccupation, or at least ought to be a change from a preoccupation with not only Soviet leadership, but the Soviet Union itself, toward a recognition that events in our own hemisphere might have equal import for our country. And secondly, a recognition that we ought to develop that in thinking about a more peaceful world, we need to think not only in terms of military weapon systems, but clearly we have to think in economic terms, and that the debt problem may be more of a threat in this hemisphere than any of the configuration of military challenges. Now, that may be putting too much into what you said, but I guess my question is, what do you feel we need to do differently in this country to deal with changes on this order of magnitude, even especially recognizing that we're still trying to achieve balances of power that work, but where power is equally economic as it is military and so on?
Well, I didn't want to imply that that military security has become less important. And I believe that military security is indeed an area where rationally bipartisan consensus ought to be achievable, because there are not that many options that one has. We have been going on in much of the post-war period on an excessively technological approach to military security, and we have not achieved a national consensus in an area in which really it ought to be easier than in some others. The relationship between nuclear and conventional weapons, the kind of military establishment we want, the relationship between forces in being and the forces we need to create, and sometime the options we want to create in the future, all of this tend to get done on an ad hoc basis as part of a budgetary process in which, if there is no clear-cut concept imposed, in periods of budgetary plenty, as many categories as possible are being established, and in periods of budgetary shortage, the things are cut that are most painful in order to get a political backlash. That's no way to get to a concept of defense that we can sustain. It's the problem of this year. We don't have all that much time. The new Mexican president, who is actually a free market-oriented, for foreign investment, from every point of view, highly acceptable to us from a philosophical point of view, cannot continue a 6-year program of austerity that has reduced the real wages of Mexican workers by 40%. No democratic leader can survive this. And therefore, we have to find some method of relief. There are 50 technical solutions once we make up our mind that it's got to happen. Brazil has an election in November. Argentina has an election in May. And if those elections go badly, and if they all unite in challenging the United States, we will not be able to create in the Western Hemisphere a structure in which the nations feel that America is relevant to their future. And what we will gain in debt repayment, we will lose in exports. It's even in our own national interest. We are asking our manufacturers to pay the banks. That's really what it amounts to. And this seems to me to be a fundamental problem, independent of what we do in the security field. In Europe, the Soviets have put forward the proposition of a European home from the Urals to the Atlantic. It's an absolutely preposterous idea. What happens to the 2/3 of the Soviet Union beyond the Urals? It makes us a visitor in the place where we have our forces. Some European foreign ministers have said that America can have a room in that European home. It's awfully nice of them. It's totally unacceptable to us. We should have a notion of a European home in which the home starts at the Soviet frontier, and Eastern Europe and Western Europe get politically united in some fashion. in which then the Soviet Union has to behave like a normal state towards its neighbors and is entitled to some security guarantees, and within which we then make the arrangements between NATO and other military blocs. But that requires some political initiative, and it's in that sense that we have to seize the high ground of the debate. But I want to stress, I do not believe that military security has become less important. But what we have lacked for a considerable period of time, I think I supported the buildup of the Reagan administration, but I think when all that money was being generated, there should have been an insistence on coming up with a doctrine in the name of which it was going to be used, because then we would have better criteria today to deal with it. And I think that that the Bush administration should have that, and I'm sure will have that from what I read, as one of its top priorities.
Thank you, Dr. Kissinger. We are honored by your presence here this afternoon, and we are grateful for your views and observations about the world beyond our borders. We appreciate very much your participation. Ladies and gentlemen, we are in for another special event this afternoon. The National Geographic Society is renowned for its pictures showing us the wonders and the opportunities that exist in the world beyond our borders. The National Geographic's chairman and president, Gil Grosvenor, has commissioned a multimedia show especially for this meeting. The show is a powerful statement which I believe will impress you and make you think. The show's title, appropriately enough, is Connections, a copy of which is in front of each governor on the desk. Last year, I taught an elementary school geography class, and I talked about the geography of the chocolate bar, where the ingredients come from and how they get here. We then went to the candy factory where many of those children's parents work. In a way they will never forget, the children saw the connections between their own lives and the rest of the world. This show, in 11.5 minutes, sends the same message. Before we begin, I'd like to thank National Geographic Chairman and President Gil Grosvenor, Todd Gipstein, who wrote the show, Dean Conger, the show's executive producer, Susan Monroe, the manager of the Society's Geographic Education Program, and all of the other people who worked so hard to make this production possible. If someone would lower the lights, we'll show the film.
America. The pictures weave a tapestry of a nation. The tapestry is strongest when it wraps our hearts, weakest when it shrouds our eyes from seeing the world as it is. The closer I look at the pictures, the more I see the individual elements that make them up. Like the nation they portray, the images only exist as an ever-changing pattern of connections. And like the nation, the dots are brightest and most powerful when the many merge and become one. And then the station is off the air. I'm left with a chaotic jumble of dots. The powerful images of America burn on only in memory, but they light the way to a brighter tomorrow.
Fighting broke out overnight between rival
Late at night,
along the border.
I'm alone, but not isolated.
Base, killing at least 49 soldiers.
I watch events taking place half a world away. The pictures are, at any instant, snapshots of history.
Anti-United States demonstration by a crowd of more than
Ever faster they swirl across my screen, a blizzard of people and places, causes and effects, a tapestry of connections.
The president reaffirmed his pledge not to negotiate with any terrorist group for the
The
hostages.
governor said that cheaper foreign labor was taking jobs from his state.
22 pounds of heroin was seized along with a small amount of cocaine.
It is a tenet of the information age that every dot can be connected to all others. Governments know it.
And it was announced at a press conference today.
Advertisers know it.
And now you can join the fun too.
So do terrorists.
Bomb exploded on a crowded street.
All of them manage our hunger for information to their own ends.
There was worldwide
The
resentment.
global reach and speed of connections has shortened the cycle of cause and effect. History is energized, events connecting like ideas flashing across nerves at the speed of light. But for all the information and images that flow to us from the world, we Americans are not seeing the picture beyond the pictures. Our perspective is too narrow. As a nation, we have all the information we want, but not the knowledge we need. Our understanding of world geography is poor. Too many Americans see the world as disconnected fragments. And when we fail to make the connections, we risk dismissing as irrelevant events that have profound effects on our lives.
Recent events would not affect current U.S. policy.
アメリカ人は国際市場競争に必要な外国語に精通していない。
We assume that American culture is world culture, when in fact ours is just one thread in the complex weave of the world.
Goes beyond national boundaries. We are citizens of the world.
No one nation, no one ideology, no one economy or culture drives the world.
In a speech before the UN Security Council,
As the globe has become more connected, influence has been diffused.
the delegate from India today demanded more.
In the past few decades, we have learned the hard way how entangled we are in the sticky web of interdependence that connects all nations.
The attack against the U.S. was launched to draw attention away from the country's internal economic...
We've seen the course we've charted changed by decisions and events in which we had no part or control. We've been pulled by connections to places we did not want to go. We've felt the fabric of our nation frayed and torn. We've been reminded of our vulnerability, victimized by forces creating connections that are unpredictable and irrational. We've learned what happens when a vital connection is broken, felt the fear of dependence on tenuous allies. Changing currents have pushed world markets in new directions. We now compete where once we sailed alone. Our history is driven by the winds of change, the currents of world events that grow stronger and swifter every year. Since we can't order up the winds we want, we must learn to sail the winds we have. America's ship is her infrastructure, the transportation systems that connect us, the industries that fuel our growth and economy. Our ship was built for calmer winds, for milder currents. Will it be able to withstand the storms of our modern world? The same technology that for so long defined the cutting edge has lost its edge. With so many people trying to make connections, the web has become snarled, tangled in its own complexity. Sometimes, like a cancer, connections spread too far, too fast, poisoning the land, eroding the health of our resources. Our environment shows the wear and tear of years of growth. Our social infrastructure, too, shows its ills, reminding us what happens when people become disconnected, when they are cast adrift and lost to society.
Today said that 1/3 of the nation's homeless are children.
But to have problems is not to embrace defeat. Instead, Problems should be a call to action, to renewed determination. Every new day brings with it a chance to change the future. The challenge facing America in the days and decades ahead will be to modernize our ship and sail it with a steady hand.
Economic indicators are up. The United States automakers reporting record sales for the first quarter. They pointed to a better trade balance.
Research scientists reported new developments in superconducting technology that will affect all areas of computing.
Part of our future is unknown. Our destiny lies ahead, shrouded in mystery. But part of our future is here, now. For it is our children who will command our ship in the years to come. Their understanding of how the world fits together and their readiness to compete effectively is our responsibility. We must teach our children, invest in their education as our most priceless resource. As events of the world swirl about them, we must connect them to that world. Our children must learn geography. They must understand people and cultures, world markets, and emerging technologies.
Okay, who can tell me where Japan is? Yes, David?
We must teach them to see things not in isolation, but as part of a larger whole. They must learn how to put each piece in its proper place, how to unify diversity.
Society reported that geographic literacy in U.S. schools has improved with state-supported programs.
We should make our children aware and remind ourselves of a larger destiny, one that goes beyond the ambitions of any one nation, the destiny of our Earth. In our lifetime, we have had the opportunity to see the world as it truly is, isolated in space, a tiny, glowing dot, too far from any others to connect. Seen from so distant a perspective, the blizzard of diversity, the complex web of connections, the turbulent storms of change all merge into a peaceful unity. We see a fragile planet that is our home, a home we all share. Ultimately, that must unite us.
God bless all of you on the good earth.
To see our world this way gives us a new perspective on the tapestry of life on Earth. That new perspective is important. It is the seed from which change will grow. When we make new connections, when we look at things in new ways, we gain new insights, discover new patterns and affinities. The process builds on itself and ultimately leads to something that is, like the world, greater than the sum of its parts. Something grand and inspiring that will endure for generations. A legacy to be cherished. Symbols, myths, icons. Every nation has them. Each of us find in them a link to our past and a path to our future. Our future lies out there somewhere, in the hearts of decision makers, in the hopes of children. It lies in the challenges that await us, the opportunities, the frontiers. It lies beyond the storms of history, the currents of change. Our future lies in each of us, dots in the darkness waiting to connect, whose combined brilliance will light the way to a brighter tomorrow.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think that show sets the stage nicely for our next speaker. Governor Tom Kean of New Jersey is chairing our task force on international education. He has undertaken the assignment with his usual energy and gusto. Before asking Tom to review the task force report for us and to introduce our next speaker, I'd like to congratulate him on accepting the presidency of Drew University when his term ends. I think we're all grateful to him that he will continue his commitment to education. Governor Kean.
Governor Beliles, thank you very much. My fellow governors, when you listen to our next speaker, when you listen to Dr. Kissinger, see that film, at least I, in sense, am filled with a sense not only of the present and the future, but a sense of history. I was a history major, a governor state that's fiercely proud of its role in American history. Each year we New Jerseyans recreate Washington's crossing of the Delaware, and each year we celebrate the exciting victories at Trenton and Princeton and Monmouth and Grover's Mills. Last Halloween we celebrated the 50th anniversary of Grover's Mills. That was Orson Welles' broadcast of the War of the Worlds. Little Grover's Mills is where supposedly the Martians landed, or didn't land. And we recall all the crazy things that happened. One man shot full of holes a local water tower because he mistook it in the fog for the invaders. And another packed up his family in a car, and as an excitement promptly backed right through the garage door that he'd forgotten to open. "Leave it by the driveway," he yelled at his wife. "We won't need that thing anymore anyway." Now, had such an event taken place, I can predict the reaction of almost every governor in this room. We'd have called our scheduling offices and we'd try to find out just how fast we could book the first available flight to Mars. What an opportunity for exports. Talk about foreign trade. But what challenges would be involved? How would we trade with aliens from another planet? We wouldn't know their habits or their customs, their wants or taboos. We wouldn't speak Martian. How would we negotiate? We'd want to be their friends, but we wanted to make sure that something we said was taken as a compliment and not as an insult. And the kicker is we couldn't afford to ignore them because Japan wouldn't, Russia wouldn't, Korea wouldn't. In short, our economic well-being would depend on how quickly we could learn the language and the customs of these alien creatures. Now, with that background, I would suggest you read our report on international education that we released yesterday. What you find there will bring you right back to Earth. Our report doesn't mention Venus, but how about Venezuela? Half the adults in America can't name one single country in South America. It doesn't mention Mars, but it does refer to Mexico and the fact that 1 out of 4 Dallas high school seniors can't name the country just south of our borders. These countries are not on other planets, but from what our study told us, they might as well be. The sad truth is that Americans know about as much about the Netherlands as they do about Neptune, and that, of course, is almost nothing. Our ignorance of the languages and customs of visitors from other planets would be understandable. But our ignorance of the language and customs of other peoples on our own planets is deplorable and totally unacceptable. More than that, it's a handicap to peace and a handicap to the prosperity we need. Reversing this nation's trade deficit depends on our doing a better job of selling our wares abroad. Every governor knows that. And every $1 billion of export creates 25,000 new jobs here in the United States of America. And the bad news is that the rest of the world has moved well ahead of us in geography, in languages, and so many other things that are important to international trade. But the good news is there are some educational islands of excellence. In an otherwise barren sea, we highlight these in our report, and we suggest ways to expand these somewhat isolated programs into a network. And there's one recommendation I'd like to stress. We governors need to use our bully pulpits to spread the word on the importance of international education. We might even follow the example of the religious reformer John Wesley. You know, on preaching one day, Wesley noticed that some of his congregation were fast asleep. So Wesley cried out, "Fire! Fire!" And of course the sleepers awoke with a tremendous start and anxiously looked around and said, "Where's the fire? Where?" "In hell," said Wesley, "for those who sleep during my sermons." Part of our job as governors is going to be to light that fire under Americans. There have already been a number of prophets who've been warning about this, but too many of them have been ignored. In all our recommendations, from retraining our teachers to joining schools and businesses for the benefit of both, these recommendations are basic, realistic, and above all, we believe they're practical. They deal more with follow-through than they do with philosophy. We hope this report serves to move forward the national debate on international education, and I have every expectation that it will. Already, Governor Belials and I, along with Governors Casey, Orr, Perpich, Martinez, McKernan, and Hunt and Castle, have taught a geography class, at least one of them in our state. Our efforts aren't going to end either with yesterday's report or today's session, just as the challenges that confront us in this country aren't going to go away. We have no intention of disbanding or disappearing. For example, today we are issuing 2 additional documents on international education. The first lists organizations with resources that could be useful to teachers and principals interested in offering international education programs. And the second describes activities states have undertaken to make international education available to the business community. And our goal in issuing these is to really spread the word from coast to coast. And we're doing more than merely making suggestions. For instance, 3 governors have agreed to join me in the Governor's Geographic Ambassadors Program. New Jersey, Virginia, Minnesota, and Florida will each designate a group of exchange students, both international students here on exchange and American students who have come from an exchange abroad, to be special ambassadors to go into the schools. And their goal is somehow to excite elementary and junior high school students about other places, about people, and help bring the kind of textbooks and writing they see, bring it alive. And finally, I'd like to announce that in April, I'll be hosting a national conference in New Jersey to further explore in-depth strategies to expand international education. I'm hoping that all governors will send at least 2 representatives from their states to attend, and I'll promise you this won't be a junket, that they'll be working very, very hard. I started out by talking about visitors from other planets. Let me close with a story about former astronaut Neil Armstrong. The famous photographer Yusa Kosh and his wife were having lunch with Neil Armstrong, and after a photographic session, Armstrong questioned the couple about the very many different countries that they had visited. "But Mr. Armstrong," protested Mrs. Kosh, "you've walked on the moon, and we want to hear about your travels." And the astronaut replied apologetically, "You know, the moon is the only place I've ever been." And I think somehow that embarrassment is a symbol of the challenge Americans face today. We are capable of amazing things, nothing short of launching into space to learn about other planets, and yet we have neglected the more mundane but essential task of learning more about our fellow beings here on the planet Earth. We are alone in having set foot on the face of the moon, but we are not alone here on this planet. This is where we have to make our way, economically, politically, strategically. We must educate ourselves about the world and certainly the people within it. Thank you very much. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you a man I have long admired. David Halberstam's thorough investigations and insightful work in Vietnam earned him a Pulitzer Prize before he reached the age of 30. And then he wrote in greater depth. And right now, if you and I, or for that matter, any of our children, want to learn about how this nation got involved in Vietnam, there is only one book that is required reading, and that is The Brightest and the Best. And we all know, and certainly in our business we know, the tremendous importance of communications, the newspapers, the rise of television. And if you want to learn best how this occurred and what its effect has been on us, then you simply have to read The Powers That Be, because it's the best work on the subject. And his book, The Reckoning, is the metaphor of our time, and I happen to believe the one required book, the one required piece of reading for every policy planner and government official in America. And let me tell you just one further thing. If you get to know David personally, you'll find him to be as decent and as thoughtful a person as he is brilliant in print. Ladies and gentlemen, David Holderstein.
Thank you very much, Governor Kane. I'd never met Secretary Kissinger before, and he was very generous about the best and the brightest. He congratulated me on how perceptive it was and thanked me for doing it, and then thanked me for not having written about him and his administration. I thought that was... I like the National Geographic film. In it somehow is what I would call the American baby. An American baby is someone who votes against school bond referenda, doesn't monitor the amount of homework his or her children are doing, and then thrills to ads in a political campaign that show the Koreans or the Japanese doing something unfair to us. The world is unfair to us. It isn't. It is the world that we live in. With no disrespect to Secretary Kissinger, I believe some of the wrong people are talking about national security these days, and I think it should be more people from this room. I think you know more about it. I think you know whether this country works or not, or is working. The strength of America today began with the investments and the covenants and the bonds that most of us got when we grew up in the 40s. What we do today projects the future for the next generation. Whether our educational system is working adequately at the core. Most of you who are governors in the major industrial states know and have the constant dilemma of changing jobs, changing industrial base, and whether the people who graduate from your high schools or don't even make it through are qualified to take jobs. A projection in the most basic sense. The future, our strength, and finally, yes, national security. If you were locating a factory today, would you choose a country that had 99% literacy and a kind of quality of people who can almost all handle a basic mathematical textbook? Or would you take an area, unfortunately there are far too many of them here in this country, where the education is erratic and the basic mathematical background weak? National security is not just a missile count. It is an index of broad national health, of covenants that hold, of a society that is harmonious. Recently, I lectured at Hiram College, a wonderful small school in Ohio, and I sat there talking about the importance of education in this new competitive world where so many new nations are surging into the middle class. And I was with 8 or 9 very bright young students, and I asked them, I mean, we're talking about the heartland of America. We're not even talking about inner cities. I asked them for the consensus of how many hours their high school classmates had spent doing homework at night. The consensus was half an hour. Half an hour. When I grew up in a small mill town in the 40s in the northwest quadrant of Connecticut, we thought that we competed athletically for jobs and for girls with the great metropolis of Torrington 9 miles away. How do you tell today's children that they are competing with the children of Osaka, Seoul, Taiwan, Singapore, perhaps one day Jakarta, perhaps one day Beijing? Hungry, driven young people who have a sense of optimism about their lives, that it's going to get better, who in their energy and their commitment to education are more like our grandparents than they are like us. That is a very tough equation, and it is out there. The people who are shooting off our toes in this country, not the Russians, they're us. What you see driving down the street are not Moskva cars. They are Hondas, Toyotas, Mazdas. It is us who have to change and adapt to a world that is enormously different. And it is on this generation. We are not just the custodians of a political society, political system. We are the custodians of an economic system as well. And when CBS so casually and blithely sells CBS records to Sony for the immediacy of profit, with all the future value-added jobs that means, something really wrong. I'm going to cut through some of these things a little quickly. Dr. Kissinger did use 20 minutes of my time, which will not likely be forgotten. He might, I told him that it wasn't out there, I might still write about him. The danger is not that American hegemony is over. It is over. It's not the worst thing in the world. We're an enormously rich, blessed society of great resourcefulness. The danger is it's over, and we do not accept the new realities, the new limitations. It's almost as if we, seeing a change, seeing other nations doing things that we used to do better than anyone else, and these new nations doing them better, are paralyzed. We don't seem to understand how to change our resource. We can't even tax ourselves properly, probably, on gasoline. The danger is in, therefore, looking for scapegoats. Japan and Korea may be difficult competitors. There may be protectionism there. The reason they've been so successful is they've had a primacy of education and a primacy of manufacturing. The great secret headline that isn't in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times is in the last 2 years or so, Japan has absorbed what is virtually a quantum shock, quantum change in the evaluation of the yen dollar, and kept coming and kept coming. Something that everybody thought would have knocked them flat, and because they are process-driven, they have kept coming. And the Japanese challenge is just the first. On their heels are the Koreans and many others. Let me quickly define, if I can, one age, an age that is over, and perhaps a new age in which we have already entered. The age that is over is the one that was brought to us by World War II, when we were brought kicking and screaming to the zenith of our power, when we, protected by oceans in an age when weaponry could not cross an ocean, came through unscathed, and all our potential competitors, allies and adversaries, were in different ways ravaged and broken by that war. France and England were victors, but they were exhausted, bled white, about to lose their colonies, or in the case of France, fight 2 colonial wars. Germany defeated, 25 million people lost, cut in half. Soviet Union a victor, again 25 million people lost, with an economic system that demonstrably does not work. Japan defeated, and almost not just defeated, but a vision of Japanese greatness collapsed in front of them. And we were rich in a world that was poor, and we mistook an historical accident and believed that it was a permanent condition. That period, the period where we were enormously powerful on the basis of cheap oil, domestic and from the Middle East, the American century or the oil century, that era is over. It ended probably the day that we had to put a car barrier up against the Japanese. It is also an age when richness in a society, economic richness, was measured really by soil and mineral and size. Size was better, temperate climate, oil, other mineral things underneath. That's terrific. What is important about the Japanese challenge is that they are the pioneers in a new age when economic power comes from the maximization of the human brain. And that is going to be the norm, and we are either going to meet that challenge or fail. And we will have no one else to blame. The richness of our upper educational system. When I spoke for Governor Deukmejian in California, I talked about the nation of California with that great upper educational system. How we could be lacking at this moment is shameful, but we are. And it is a new era. Secretary Shultz, in his peroration at the Iran country hearing, talked about the age in the past when you were rich in communications if you had copper under the soil. But it doesn't matter anymore because we live in an age of fiber optics. Now, Lee Iacocca, when he's complaining about the Japanese, likes to talk about a level playing field. And in some minor ways, he's right. The Japanese are often difficult and protectionist. For a time, the yen was very softly valued. But in a larger sense, the playing field is for the first time even. It took 30 or 40 years after World War II for other nations to catch up with us, to have systems, banking systems, educational systems, norms, factory systems that were good. And no longer, and they have it now, no longer do we automatically set the pace. No longer is American things automatically the best. But we can go on into this new era if we accept it for what it is. I think we've already, people always like to wait to the year 2000 and do the new century. I think we've already entered a new century, a century post-hegemony for us and the Soviet Union. Let me give you, I think, a couple benchmarks of it. The American experience in Vietnam, which sets a limit on us in certain political ways, a limit of power poorly used. The end of American economic hegemony as manifested by the challenge of the Japanese. The rise of Secretary Gorbachev, and I'd like to make a footnote here. I don't give a damn whether he's a good guy, charmer, where he gets his suit, where Mrs. Gorbachev gets her hair, whether she's better looking than Mrs. Reagan or not. I think it is a profound historic change. Barbara Tuchman, a week before she died, probably our greatest recent historian, referred to it as the most important thing she had seen in her lifetime, 77 years. The Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, and I think symbolically of the Gorbachev era, and we don't have to like him or even do things for him, just let it play its hand out, an admission by the Soviets that it doesn't work, that their economic system doesn't work. Obviously, it's going to be very hard if you've had a society where the man who has the raincoat factory 50 miles from Moscow makes very bad raincoats that fit only one size, and you tell him to have free market raincoats of different sizes and colors. It's going to be hard to get him to change. But it is an enormously important thing. In addition, the coming of a great shared middle class with countries like Japan and Korea coming, surging in, confident, and feeling the ascent of their societies, of where the covenants truly work, the changing nature of work, so much of it based upon education. It is critical, and it is critical in this country. As long as in the average high school in America, the average male child, 15, who gets good marks is considered a nerd unless he's William Bradley of Missouri and New Jersey, then we're in trouble, because the driving engine of East Asia is education. And you see it in America. You see it in some school where the grades haven't been very good, and somehow the new Asian immigrants move in, and suddenly the grade scores go up. It is critical to changing. The future for this country, there's no reason why it can't be bright. We can do a lot of technical things. We can raise trade to national security. We can have greater incentives in our tax for people who are truly productive, other than these young hit people on Wall Street who leverage and manipulate and move paper around. We can have greater scientific grants. We can change our capital formation to encourage true long-range planning in industry. But we are a blessed country. We have dramatically the best agriculture in the world. Exceptional mineral resource, it means less. A vibrant venture capital system. A diverse and really varied economy. The best higher educational system in the world, filled, I am afraid, with, in the scientific component, with too many foreign students and not enough Americans, and a diverse and potentially talented people. This is a report card for us 40 years from now. Our weaknesses: a declining secondary school system, and expectations built upon 40 years of affluence that life is easier than it's really going to be from now on. It's not something that can be dealt with. We're still privileged. The question really is, can we adjust our expectations, and above all, can we realize in an average American home that a family's dignity, a child's ability to compete, to have a job of value and dignity, is absolutely tied to his or her performance in early years and in high school? Can we get average Americans to know that if they do not do that, they are breaking the legs and the arms of their own children? Thank you very much for having me here today.
David, thank you very, very much. Very insightful and to the point. The two members, besides myself, of the task force, whose report you got yesterday, were very, very helpful and very, very perceptive, and I'd like, if I could, to call on them each for a question for David Halberstam. First, Governor Wahi.
David, one of the interesting things about your analysis and also in your book is the idea, I think, that Americans have expectations built on influence, and to a large extent that appears to be true. We are a country that probably, despite our difficulties, our challenges internationally, still in my mind have the higher standard of living, and et cetera, and et cetera. And yet we compete against people like Japan, who culturally may have a different set of values than we do. A classic example would be the high rate of savings that is achieved by the individual or the public sector in Japan versus the rate of savings done by the American public. Partially, the reason for that is that in Japan, the average family doesn't think about owning a home or a car, which is something that we in this country take as an American right. I would like to hear your opinion on how much we may need to change culturally if we are in fact going to be competitive internationally against some of the challenges our country now faces.
I think we need to be more disciplined. I think one of the key things about going into what I would call an age of a more crowded middle class, where more nations are sharing the middle class. For example, in the old days, in the de facto monopoly years post-World War II, 45 through 75, really quite symbolically, General Motors set the norm. And whatever they priced a car at, Ford would come in and then Chrysler behind them, and very soon Studebaker and Packard and others could not compete on the scale that they did, and therefore folded. And so the big three picked up a lot of bad habits, and then there was no competition until came the Japanese. And it's a symbolic thing of, and now the Koreans, a shared middle class. General Motors no longer automatically sets the price. In fact, if anybody does, possibly Toyota does. So I think the Japanese system, which will not necessarily work here, is a great distillation system. Less goes in at one end and more comes out at the other than anything I've ever seen. If I were making a cultural judgment, I would call it the culture of adversity compared to our culture of affluence. We've had 40 to 50 years of middle-class affluence in this country, and it's been a wonderful thing, and you also pick up some bad habits. I don't think we have to change our standard of living so dramatically as we have to be more careful, we have to save more, and we have to waste less. I mean, I think common sense would tell you that about the world you're living in. You're suddenly going to share it with more.
Next, the other member of a task force, one of our great education governors, Governor Perpich.
If you were governor today, elected this year, how would you motivate citizens of your state to really raise the level of learning and motivate those young people?
Well, I think it begins with the bully pulpit, and you have the sort of the derivative bully pulpit. The people who should be your allies, the networks. I noticed this week they have they got a pageant in Japan, so they decided to cover Japan, but generally they've done a scabrous job of it because it doesn't provide pictures. I mean, it doesn't have, Lee Iacocca doesn't go over and punch Suichiro Honda in the nose, so that which has been happening at the core of our economy doesn't make the evening news. I mean, critical part of the circulatory system of America, which is network news, does a very poor job of this most important thing. How do you do it? I mean, it seems to me that you have to tie education to jobs. You have to define what the jobs are and let these people know in the most average houses that their children aren't going to make it, that it really has to begin, that it's got to begin in the home, that if the home, that's where it begins with the Japanese, it begins with the home. I mean, the Confucian culture, education, and authority has been just nicely mutated into the modern century. They've done that enormously skillfully. We have got to, in some way, in a country which was so rich that we could really have cowboy economics and cowboy attitudes, we've got to let people know that the people they are wounding in these homes are their own children, that it really is at stake, that they're not going to be able to compete for jobs. I guess you just have to keep hitting and going to schools, going to jobs, and combining jobs with schools and letting them know if on the nature, the changing nature of work. I mean, the new jobs that give middle class, by and large, take technical skills. You've got to have been to a junior college or have some mathematical skill. To get a job at the Nissan plant in Tennessee, you really have to have been in the Air Force for a couple of years, would be to a junior college generally. They take some mathematical skill. And I think if people are warned and don't do anything, God save them.
I'm sorry that we don't have time for more questions. This is fascinating and also some of the most valuable material we could be talking about. It's been a wonderful session. I just want to thank David Holdestam for taking his time to come with us and share his thoughts today.
This afternoon we have focused on the world beyond our borders, specifically international education. We also have two other task force reports underway to be released between now and our summer meeting. I'd like to call on Governor Mabus, the chairman of the Task Force on Foreign Markets, for a brief status report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to say how much I've enjoyed this program, and particularly David Halberstam, who early in his reporting career was a reporter for the West Point, Mississippi Leader Call. And I like to think that some of the ideas he got in Clay County, Mississippi. The Foreign Markets Task Force has been at work on the job it was given to develop ideas for state strategies, to expand our foreign markets, and to increase the American share of world trade. It's critical how well we as states respond to this challenge, for our response, as you've heard, will go a long way in determining our standard of living into the next century. We've tried to take a realistic view of the international marketplace, the dramatic increase in competitors and competition, the change in the American position, the fact that survival for virtually every sector of our economy mandates being a player in the world export market in the next decades. We've tried to come up with innovative ways for states to deal with this complicated, changing, unpredictable, and interdependent environment. We've looked at ways such as pooling resources with other states, developing a comprehensive state plan for trade, looking for new non-traditional markets to nurture the customers of the future, and encouraging our existing businesses to expand their markets and their horizons, to adapt their products and to diversify their trade relationships. With these thoughts in mind, the task force will release its report here in Washington on Friday, April 14th. In concert with the report's release, the National Governors Association will co-host a conference with the Agency for International Development and the Bretton Woods Committee. The conference will focus on what states can do to increase trade with developing markets. I invite and encourage you all to join Governors Beliles, Gardner, myself, and others on April 14th. One of the outgrowths of the task force work will be a possible trip to Europe from the 5th to the 7th of July, led by Jerry Beliles. The group will meet with high-ranking officials in the European Economic Community. There are a limited number of spaces for this trip, so if you're interested in going, please let the NGA staff know immediately. States today will, to a great extent, determine what America's role in the global economy will be. It is an obligation and an opportunity which cannot be overstated and must not be overlooked. We hope you can join us on the 14th of April here in Washington. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Governor. Our other task force report chairman, Governor Jack McKernan, is not with us today. He'll be arriving sometime later in the evening. But he's asked me to give his report. The task force report on research and technology is trying to find out how state governments can be more involved in the commercial application of the science and research projects that are going on in this country. We know that we are significant leaders in the development of new technologies. We're not so good at the commercial application. Translating that progress in science and technology into products and processes that will help us regain our competitive edge in world markets is the focus of Governor McKernan's task force. It is examining the state role in moving new technologies more quickly from the laboratories to the production line, and that task force report will be released in May as a part of a major conference on technology development programs in state governments. Governor McKernan's letter is before you. I might add that this task force has generated a great deal of interest across the country. The National Council on Competitiveness invited Governor McKernan and me to meet with them last year. There will be additional meetings throughout the year. 7 governors of this association attended a conference at Cape Kennedy for a comprehensive briefing on America's space program. We're very much impressed with NASA's commitment to research and technology development. It was an informative conference. It was impressive, especially for those of us who were able to see the launching of the shuttle Atlantis. Now, tomorrow, we will focus on one of our task force reports within our borders. As you know, our focus looking at within our borders is to how to regain domestic markets, how to invest more in infrastructure, especially transportation, and then how to invest in our children, the workforce of tomorrow. Governor Clinton's task force report in that area and the program I think you will find challenging and informative and stimulating. Now, before we close, I have to review some important administrative information. The rules of our association require that governors who intend to offer proposed policies that were not included in the 15-day advance mailing provide a copy of their proposal to NGA by the close of business on the day prior to the vote. If you have such a proposal, please give it to Jim Martin of the NGA staff no later than 5 p.m. tomorrow. The events for tonight's entertainment I think you will find of great interest, but they are not located close together. The reception at the Japanese Embassy is in one area of town. Dinner with the Vice President at the Blair House is at the other end of town. In each case, you need to arrive promptly for each event. So please allow sufficient time for your travel. Finally, the Committee on International Trade and Foreign Relations will be meeting in this room immediately upon adjournment. The staff in the hotel needs to make some minor changes to our room arrangement, so I'd like to ask everyone to leave promptly. The meeting is adjourned.
This plenary session titled Beyond Our Borders. We will bring you more live coverage of the National Governors Association's annual winter meeting Monday morning. At about 8:45 Eastern Time, the Committee on Energy and the Environment will meet. Governor Madeline Kunin of Vermont chairs that panel.